Awesome. Well, guys, thank you so much for being part of this conversation today around what you're seeing in terms of COVID-19 and how it's impacting the church and leadership. I really appreciate your time and sharing, your willingness to share your perspectives and your wisdom and insights into this for what you guys are seeing. As we open up this conversation, I would love to hear what's happening in your spirit as we're sitting in this kind of space. So we'll open that up. I'd love to hear a few of you share. Adrian, maybe you could kick that off for us.
Deep end. I think this probably comes at two levels for me, personal and then like my role itself in church. And so I think for me, like an unshackling of constraint in a lot of ways, like it's forcing us as a church to really start to think differently and start to like rely on God a lot more, because people aren't in front of us. We don't have that tangible physical space with people. And for me, a dismantling of idols is what's happening. Like personal wrestle of what do I rely on as my go-to for like seeking God? Like what are my rhythms? That's all changed. And so I think for me, like it's actually been a really beautiful and messy season internally. A beautiful mess.
A beautiful mess.
If there is such a thing. Yeah, that's me.
Well, one of the things that you had mentioned to me earlier, as we were kind of talking this through, was around how this season is kind of making you think about what kind of legacy you want your leadership to leave. How is COVID-19 shaping your own sense of what kind of legacy you want your leadership to have?
I mean, this time's going to be written in history books and something that we can tell our kids and grandkids of like the time that we lived through COVID. And so like for me, with a newer child is going like, what do I want? What are the things that I want to be able to tell him and say like, this is what defined that season for me. This was either the time I retreated in certain ways or the time I stepped in certain ways, or what I observed and the way I loved people, and like that's the legacy I want. And so there's a challenge within that, is to do something about it and not just have this beautiful idea of talking about COVID as the wonderful time we got locked down and we spent more time together, which is beautiful, but there has to be more to it than that.
Yep. So the challenge then is working out what that looks like moving forward, right?
Yeah.
Avril, I'd love to ask you what's been happening in your spirit, particularly as you hear Adrian share about the unshackling and the dismantling of some of the idols that we can have in church life and leadership. What's been stirring for you?
I really loved the word dismantling. I think that's a really great way of thinking about this season. I think for me, I've been watching a sifting happening in individual people's lives and also corporately in my space and in the team that I'm a part of, where what's important here, what can we let go of, what do we need to hold on to, what are my real values that are non-negotiable in this season, in my faith journey, in my in the ministry, and what is that some things that don't need my time or require as much time as perhaps I've been giving it in the past. And this time has been a time of reflection, and I'm excited about that. I think it means that there's change coming. And I'm looking forward to actually putting the pieces back together again in the next few weeks and the next few months, and actually seeing what the result of this season has been, both for me personally, but also for the ministries I'm a part of and the people I'm working with as well. It's good.
That's very cool.
Yeah.
Can I ask, do you have a sense for you personally, if you're happy to share, what God might be sifting in your own leadership, or some of the things that you might not want to pick up again once we come out of this?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there are a few things that this season has highlighted for me personally. I think the importance of spiritual discipline in the life of a leader, and this season has given pause and space to reflect on my own life with Jesus, my own relationship with him, and what time and energy I'm putting into that. But also I think from a work or a ministry or a focus on the busyness, I think that this season has given me pause to reflect on what busy actually is and how important it is, or isn't. So what if I look at my calendar, what are the things that I'm giving time to that I shouldn't be? Yeah. I want intentional ministry, not busy ministry.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That's all right.
Gil,
Thank you.
how about for you in that space of this kind of COVID-19 stripping things back and providing some space for rest and for inner work? What's been your experience with that, both kind of in your church space and for you personally in inner work you sense God might have been doing in you in this time?
Yeah, so it's like everyone's kind of saying, I think we've had a shared theme of like introspection and using this time rather than trying to adapt in a program type of fashion, but trying to make space to just consider what we're doing and how we're going about our discipleship, our personal walk. And I think in my context, particularly just sort of defining what our community values. Is it a service? Is it gathering as people? Is it certain practices or elements of a community rhythm? Like what are we holding dear and what can go by the wayside? And probably personally, there's been a real sense of busyness over my last sort of 18 months and sort of being forced into a space where that can't exist. Really gets you thinking about, like Avra was saying, like what's important, what needs to stay. And I think, the church is in this moment where we're going to be defining who we really are, not what we do. And that's an exciting thing, I think, for the church to be forced into a moment where we're looking at ourselves and we're just sort of jumping off that treadmill of pumping out services or programs and having to say, okay, what are we about? And what do we want to achieve here? And what's God's call on us in this place? And how are we doing that obediently?
Wow. Do you have any thoughts around what that process might look like for a church to go through that practically, or for you in your personal faith journey?
Yeah, well, I think probably two things. The first is just having a real sense of prayerfulness. I think this has been a moment where numerous churches and movements and denominations have just had a sense of this is a moment for the church to pray and to seek God, and that's just a beautiful thing that the church corporately is engaging with, and I think we need to reflect that as disciples, individuals. So just spending moments in prayer each day and just trying to discover what God has for us, and with the distractions removed, not filling that void with another sermon to write or a video to edit or a program to write, but just being in prayer and listening. Like, this is a moment to listen. In my church context, it's the same thing. I think we're in a moment where there's some exciting stuff going on. There's a lot of change in the community, and this is a moment, rather than trying to solve those things and find what man might do, ask what Jesus is wanting for our community. And we don't need to rush that. We don't need to fill any holes or be reactive, but just be listening. Yeah, so I think they're things that personally and as the church we need to be doing.
So good, thank you. And it's a challenge, isn't it? Because if we don't lean into that space to sit with God and listen to Him rather than being distracted by everything else, and if we don't allow the space to transform our own heart posture, then the risk, I think, is that we come out of this season going back to busyness and doing all the same things that we did before, and this season's just been a stopgap rather than something that actually is transformative, which I believe it has the potential to be. Meredy, I love something that you were sharing when we were chatting the other day about what's been bubbling around in your spirit about developing a greater dependence on God through this season. I'd love to hear more of your thoughts around that.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel very much like, for me personally and for our church, that it has been an opportunity to suddenly see that we already know this, but we're not in control. But how has this season of COVID has actually really highlighted that again, isn't it? That, we started off the year with all these hopes and dreams for what might happen for our communities and for our own personal lives and families. And then, all of a sudden that's changed, that's been disrupted. I love your word in that question, what's been disrupted. And I feel like there is a disruption. But I think for me personally, when we realise that we don't have any control over what happens, we don't have any control over any of it, we have to depend again on Jesus. And I think for me, I have tried to carve out that space to learn again how to have that deep dependence on Jesus, and not just say, fully rely on God or whatever, but actually how do I wrestle that out in my daily life with my family, with when I don't have any understanding of what might happen next or what is happening. I really believe that, those firm foundations that we can have in the Word, in our times of worship, in our times of prayer. And I really believe, Gil, as well, that those moments of prayer, I feel like the church is really stepping up in their dependence on God, and we have to look to Him. It's not us building the church. It's not us. It is actually, Jesus will build His church, and so we want to lean into that. Yeah.
That's so good, because it is, isn't it? It's really, to your points, this kind of unshackling and dismantling, really, I think, from our trust in ourselves when it comes down to it, and our own, the things that we think we've built, or the things that we think we've done, or that we get our identity from, and actually allowing this time to dismantle and sift those things, and lean back into prayer and dependence on God.
Yeah.
What do you think that would look like for you in your church community and your space to be nurturing that type of greater dependence on Jesus in a church community setting?
Yeah, I think, the start of the year this year, I really felt we really felt like our community was being brought back again to prayer, and to make that a big priority for us. And so we have, in COVID, we've had a weekly prayer meeting, and, in our own individual lives, we've been encouraging each other to really pray together, and, in our own lives. And I think, so I think definitely prayer is just putting God in His rightful place, isn't it? And it's looking to Him. And I think the Word, in our church, we follow some rhythms of communion, community and commission. And I think, the communion space where we are trying to build those practices in our lives of setting aside time, of, realising, our great need for Jesus. I think those kind of things. So prayer and spending time in the Word and accountability, all of those things help us to keep our eyes fixed on Jesus.
Yeah, so important. I was chatting with someone a couple of months ago when the restrictions were first coming in, a pastor, and she was saying that she kept thinking about that old Matt Redman song, The Heart of Worship, when the music fades and all is stripped away, and I simply come longing just to bring we all know the words, but longing just to bring something
Sing it for us.
No. Longing just to bring something that's of worth that will bless your heart. I'll bring you more than a song. Yeah. For a song in itself isn't what you've required. You search much deeper within through the way things appear. You're looking into my heart. I'm coming back to the heart of worship because it's all about you, Jesus. I'm sorry, Lord, for the things I've made it when it's all about you, Jesus. And I just thought, I feel like that is such a song for our season. And, that song was written, Matt Redman wrote that song when his church was going through a time when they felt convicted that actually they had made the worship experience into the thing that effectively they were convicted that they'd been worshipping. And so they stripped the worship, the sung worship out of their services until they could realign their heart back to Jesus. And I just sense for us in this time is God calling His people back to Him again, just to a pure heart of worship and dependence on Him and prayer, and a sifting and an unshackling from the things that we've made worship into, and purely just come back to the Father again, come back to Jesus again.
And a place of surrender, like you said, I'm sorry, Lord, for the things that we've made it and the things that have distracted us and our own sin, I guess. Yeah, I find that hugely challenging.
But it's also super exciting, isn't it? Like when I ponder the idea of what it would mean for the church to lead with prayer and the Spirit of God and worship, rather than potentially with other things that we have done in previous decades, and that's not to disparage that, but to go, what would it look like to lead with that rather than with perhaps other things that we've fallen into the default of leading with? That makes my imagination go wild, That excites me.
Well, Charlie, you've got a role where you see what's happening in lots of different churches. Do you have a sense as to what that could look like on the ground for churches to really lean into that and lead from that place of prayer and worship and dependence?
Yeah, I mean, I guess for me, I sit in a role both working with youth ministries across our state and youth leaders, and also in trying to pioneer a fledgling community as well. So I kind of see the big picture as well as the on the ground. And kind of the analogy that came to my mind this morning as I was just pondering what we were going to be talking about, it's like we've got to throw out the playbook. You know, the playbook, you know, you can become too utterly dependent upon the playbook. And sometimes you just need to play the game, to use a sporting analogy, and to listen to the coach. You know, like I think I would echo what each and every one of these guys have said, is like, wow, what does it look like for us to come back to what the coach might be saying on the field and to go, God, I want to listen to your voice first. I was hearing some great comments as we were preparing for this interview around we can't look to the other church anymore. We can't look to the super pastor. We're actually, as we were always intended to do, being called back to listen to the still small voice of the Holy Spirit. And so that's very vague and generic, but that's also context by context. And it is the principle that we want to carry on even through this COVID season. There are some things, as Avril said, that we probably want to leave behind, but there are principles like that we'll never leave behind. They're the things that are the Ancient of Days that will always be, and we want to take forward. And so, I guess that comment to what does it mean to lead with creating space for the Holy Spirit. For me, one of my great epiphanies and observations in ministry in the last couple of years has been sometimes we just really fill that space with everything but. And like, it just seems to me that where there's a movement of God or where kingdom fruit begins to break through, it always seems to be the Holy Spirit who does that, not in our own earthly strength. And so how can we create those kind of spaces? That's the wrestle.
And I think there's a risk required in that, right? Like a willingness to be able to, and you were speaking to this yesterday when we were chatting, like there's a willingness to be able to step out and be bold and trust the Holy Spirit and follow his leading rather than in the absence of a playbook, and a willingness to be able to step out and fail if necessary, but be bold. I was curious, Adrian, on your reflections on that, this stepping out and trusting God and being willing to fail. What kinds of things, say in the next 20 years of your ministry, what kind of thing would you be willing to fail at?
Just a really light question for you.
Emily.
Okay, where do we begin? Not what I've already failed at, what I'm willing to fail at.
You're willing to fail at.
Yeah, good question. I think the perspective of like what am I willing to, I don't know if it's like what am I willing to fail at or what am I willing to sacrifice and actually put before God and say like this is, you have your way. Because that's almost a failure in a lot of ways, because our like flesh, we as humans get in the way. And so like so many things, and I think the observation of like so many things that we would see as a failure maybe possibly in kingdom realm are actually a great success. And like a failure to listen to like my own pride or my own things like that is actually the greatest success in the kingdom, because it allows people to step in and arrogance doesn't get in the way. So I don't know that it's like, I hope they're the things I fail at in the earthly sense, because I know that the impact that that's going to have on in the kingdom and in people's lives is going to be so fruitful. And so, yeah, to flip your question, I raise you. Yeah, I don't know. I'd love to hear other people. What are you willing to fail at? Gil? Specifically.
Yeah. No, I think I'm with you on that, Adrian. Like, I think I'd be willing to leave opportunity that presents itself, given the fact that God is calling each church to something, and that's not everything. And so, what am I willing to leave on the table to follow the calling that God has for me in my place and my ministry and the church's ministry. I've just been really challenged by the idea of the local church being local. And I found it kind of ironic how everyone's had to go online, which is like the World Wide Web. Everyone can access it everywhere. But I'm really sensing that we need to be like hyper local and worry about our communities and not this crazy reach necessarily, but what do our people need and how do we meet that need?
But the like skill, but the like.
It's true, man. You gotta generate the like. But truly, like, what do we look like as a hyper local place, being the kingdom of God, making little pockets of the kingdom here, and that inevitably leaves things on the table. You know, a crazy opportunity that looks like it's got so much promise. What are we willing to leave in order to follow what we're called to?
And can I just add to what you're saying as well, Adrian? There's too much at stake to just play it safe. You know, particularly in this next season, this next generation, we've seen that playing it safe doesn't work, whatever work means. But we want to in our communities be advancing the kingdom through risky business of, you know, mission and evangelism and good news and whatever that may look like. But playing it safe is not the answer.
And the next generation they don't care. Like I said last night, in this prep, is like the quicker we realise that people don't care what happens in this building on a Sunday because they have no link or tie to it. So like it's completely irrelevant to them. They don't care. And so the risk is like, what does it look like to truly be in the community? And truly,
so you're saying the outsider doesn't care?
Yeah.
Just to clarify.
Yeah, the outsider doesn't care.
Yeah.
Like those that have no faith, say they may be wherever they are on the faith spectrum, but like they're not. Some of them might be watching our online services, but most of them aren't. So like there has to be a risk involved to go, how do we reach someone that is so far from this building and so far from the program that we do? And what does that look like? That's risky because that is when you may fail in your own eyes to go, well, we didn't have the conversion of person to sit on the seat, to put money in the bucket, to pay. Like, I think it's just got to reframe, and like we were talking about before, like young kids sitting on Zoom in a youth meeting, playing COD or online game and texting at the same time. It's like, there's a few barriers there to reach the lost community, and they're the people that we're wanting to reach, to see a generation come to know Jesus. And so that there's a risk in that, has to be.
Yeah. And it's interesting, isn't it? It raises this whole conversation around the future of online church. Out of that, balancing, Gil, what you were saying around this call to be local and embodied and present with people, while there's people, I mean, we're hearing that people through people's online services are reaching new people who might never step into a church on a Sunday yet are tuning in online.
That's great.
And there seems to be possibility in that for engaging people, but how do we balance those two? So Kurt Thompson, who is a Christian psychiatrist who some of you might remember he spoke at the Collective a few years back, he wrote an article recently about why we're so tired on Zoom, and basically said it's because it's a disembodied experience and we're built as human beings, which means being both spirited and embodied. And when you take away either one of those two, either being spirited or being embodied, we are living lives that are less than the full humanity that God designed and created us for. And the online experience, he says, is effectively a disembodied experience. Now you hold that together with this tension that the disembodied online church experience is reaching new people, and the church is called to represent to the world the new humanity that Jesus showed for us, which is incarnational and embodied. That's a tension to me. Like, how do we hold those two things together? I'd love to hear any thoughts you guys might have around that.
I think the online platform, so in my context, we are online every weekend. I think it's giving people an opportunity to engage in the person of Jesus. And for some of them, it's for the very first time. So even though there is there is a disembodiment, because we're not present, we're not engaged, we're not face to face, if this platform is giving people the chance to engage with Jesus, the idea of him, in a very real way for them, then I'm excited. Because I think there is, for a lot of people, that being present face to face, walking through the doors of the church, that's a really big hurdle and can be quite threatening. And if this online platform gives people a non-threatening way to engage with the person of Jesus, I'm all for it. Yeah.
Thank you. Anyone else? Other perspectives?
Yeah, I think what it's also doing is creating a hunger within us for when we do eventually return physically. You know, like I think, as to what someone said before, like you can grow apathetic towards something. And I think by and large, sadly, a lot of the church, not saying all churches or all generations or anything like that, it just became, we were overfed. We'd become fat Christians, and the gathering began to not mean much. It's like after you've been to the buffet, you don't want more to eat. But actually, I feel like when we are able to return in the flesh, like there's going to be this sense in which we're all coming around the table again, and we're reminded this is actually what church was meant to be.
Yeah.
This is really like the purity of what we're invited to, with Jesus at the head of the table and God's church seated around him. And that excites me, you know, and I'd hope that would be met with anticipation when we are able to meet in the flesh to do that again. It's almost like we're craving it, you know?
Yeah.
Sure, there has to be more than the gathering, though. Like I completely agree, like the engagement tool that online is, and the gathering itself in the physical space, but like this has to be a time of complete reorientation of all people to put meaning back into that gathering, like, which I know what you're saying is that, but it's like if there's not more to our gathering and coming back together than just being in physical presence together, and if that's it, then we are quickly back to the apathetic church that potentially we were before. Like there has to be something new emerge in this, and a great challenge, because apathy doesn't just go away like that. Like the quicker that we can go back to normal would be the ultimate for some, because normality and the rhythms that they're in gives this security that they can just do life as they did. And so, like, without bigger vision of what the gathering is and what it actually, like, gathering is a sacrifice, and it has to draw us closer to Jesus, point our eyes towards Jesus more and more, and actually force us into new rhythms in our life to build in this foundation of faith away from apathy, or we just have the same gathering we've always had, and the bigger churches are going to get bigger because they're attractive, and the smaller churches are just going to stay the same, and we end up with the same landscape we've always had. Like, there has to be something more. It can't just be getting back in a building, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
What do you think then, for you and for others as well, when it comes to our services, our gatherings, what do you think it has been, if there has been something that holds us back from experiencing that flourishing in our gathering? And maybe it's not there everywhere. Maybe it's just some places.
I think you have to look personally first, like reflection of your own life, before you can make comment on corporate. But like for me, I think I've done what I've always known. Like,
Wow.
And like, you have to honor the longevity of ministers that have gone before us to make that a secure place for people. Yeah. But if we don't honor them in our transition to what is next, and if they can't move with us into what is next, into what the next generation needs and what the Holy Spirit is doing, like, we are saying that the Holy Spirit is only as creative as the church we've always had, or God is only as big as the church. Like, the fruit that we've seen is all there is to it. And so I think there's great honor in going, the foundation that those that have built is the best place for us to springboard us into the future. And I know that's everyone's heart. And so before making comment on that, it's then going, do I have like the life, the spiritual life, the maturity, like the foundation of my own life to actually want to lead that, be part of that, or like biggest one is like, can God trust me with that? Like, it's a big question.
It raises the question, what do you guys think is important in the life of a church leader moving, particularly in our generation, moving on from here, if we are to step into some of these new things that God seems to be opening up and inviting us into? What's required of us in terms of our inner lives? Meredy, what do you think?
I think one thing that comes to mind for me is our ability to release our fears and to be able to, leave some of those concerns about, our fear of what other people think, our fear of, what other churches are doing and what I'm not doing, or, mine's not as good as theirs, those kind of comparison things. I think we have to realise that we're all, as Gil has already said, we're all called to different expressions of what that might look like and how we're going to run in our lane and, shake off whatever entangles and actually chase after what he's called us to. And I think fear definitely is one of those ones, and I think that's big for our generation, if I can say that. It is a big one. And I think if we can leave that behind, we may be able to step in.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's huge. I heard someone say once that fear puts a ceiling on things, right? If you're afraid of spiders, you don't go near spiders. If you're afraid of heights, you don't go near heights. And it's the same with this. It's a really powerful one, I think. And it sounds like there's so many things that we think ought to be left behind. Some of the pieces where our identity and our sense of, I suppose, significance is caught up, whether that's in church structures or processes or things we think that we have built, or leave those things behind, whether it's pride or control or fear. But the thing that seems to come through that we sense is timeless and needs to continue into the future is discipleship. I think we're all agreed on that. And so it would be interesting to think through what are some of the things that distract us from that, coming back to the heart of worship and worshipping Jesus and following him in firstly being a disciple and then who makes disciples. But what are some of the things that can distract us along the way? Gil?
Man, what doesn't distract us? Really? Like...
a butterfly.
Like, there's so much, and I've just been, challenged with this in this season. I'm a pastor of young people, and I think that vocation is helping young people practice the way Jesus, and I got to do that well. And maybe up until this point, there's been massive parts of my life that have been able to go by the wayside. I can run a discussion group and put a 3-point sermon together pretty quickly and learn the lingo and stuff, but I've been really challenged in this moment. Like, what does my discipleship look like? How am I engaging in a moment where I don't really know what's going on and I don't know what's around the corner, and some of these deeper issues of like, what are my idols and how are they coming to the surface at this point? And I feel like I can't take people where I haven't gone before. So particularly with young people, like, I'm challenged with how am I using my online presence or my phone and my laptop in a way that's God-honouring and different to the world around me. And that's maybe something that right now the church is facing, is like, how do we replicate our services? How do we use social media and our new website and all these things in a way that's best? And maybe that's not the question we need to ask. It's more around, how do we as a community emanate the kingdom and kingdom values in the way that we're doing life, which is increasingly digital? How do we do that well, and how do we help each other do that? I think there's a distraction in trying to just keep up. Relevance can almost be a distraction in itself. How do we how do we try and have the best live stream or the best social media presence? And now it's like so challenging for me. Like I'm trained in marketing, so I love like a good social media presence. You know, you want it all to look nice and fit and be effective, but at the end of the day, like discipleship isn't about marketing. It's never been about marketing. It's never been about looking good. It's that inner working, that deep sort of cultivating of space for Jesus to work and move. And I find that hard right now. Like there's two sides of me trying to balance that out, and it's almost as if the ministry itself, or how I'm perceiving the ministry, becomes the distraction to the ministry, which is so meta. Such a weird place to be, but yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, it's an interesting zone or time that we're moving into now, with language around reopening, thinking about now some of the restrictions are leaving, or loosening up, easing. What does that look for you? And one thing, Meredy, that I noticed that you had said around that was actually I don't think we were ever shut.
Yeah.
I'd love to hear more of your thoughts around that.
Well, yeah, I would like to think that we were never shut, and all of us were still, we're still followers of Jesus in our houses, online, wherever we are, rubbing up against our neighbours. We're there, we're in the community, and so I like to think that we weren't shut, that we are all God's people in our own individual communities, and living and loving to make Jesus known. And I don't think that will change I pray that will not change for me. When our gathering starts again, I pray that, we will continue to realise that it isn't about walls and services, but it is actually about, reaching our neighbours and living lives that are full in his ideal of what that means, that attract people towards him, and not, Avril, before you said that on the online space people are looking in who've never looked in before, and I think that that's amazing to think that, our walls have kept people out potentially, and being able to be available online has allowed people to look into maybe what was to them a place that they couldn't step into. But I think, so what I think is that when our doors reopen again, they're not going to come in. Do you know what I mean? Nothing's going to change for people who don't know Jesus yet. They're not going to come in just when our doors, well, they may, maybe they will. Hopefully the Holy Spirit is doing amazing things in people's lives at the moment, and that maybe they will flood in. I'd like to pray for revival. But I think we have to come back to the beginning where, it is about disciples who make disciples, and how am I becoming more like Jesus on a daily basis? How is my character being shaped? How am I becoming more like him? Little Jesus is wandering around as disciples. How are we reflecting that? And, how will that mean that the church will grow as we live our lives amongst people, not just sitting in our services?
Yeah, it's so good. Because you're right, God's mission hasn't changed in the midst of all of this.
I believe that. I feel like so much has changed and yet nothing has changed. I feel like the call is still the same call.
So good. Are there any particular kind of mission fields that you've seen come to the front through the shifts that have been happening in society, from your perspective?
I think in our community, we are really local in Parramatta. We have intentionally moved there, and, we're trying to be salt and light in our local community. And, we're not, we've had challenges along the way, obviously, but we have some already connections with places and community organisations and different things that are happening in our local area that we already have connections with. So for me, I feel like one of the areas that's close to my heart is people that I already know, so mums that I'm already connecting with, neighbours that I already know, and relationships that have already been built, and trying to continue to love and to continue to hear from Jesus and be obedient into what he's asking me to do in my relationship with those people, and to be a bit weird, maybe. I feel like for so long we've tried to just be the same as everyone else, but to actually go, you know, this is we're following Jesus, this is weird. What we believe is actually crazy. That, you know what I mean? What we actually believe is crazy. And so it's profound and crazy, but how do I live that out and love my neighbours in a local way? Also, I feel like families are stressed in this time, so we've been trying to think creatively how to love families in our local school and things like that. And also, we've had lots of connections with university students. Our church has run a meal for international students in the university for a long time now, and so we have lots of connections with different students, and there's been a real call out for help for them. So, you know, there's people who have needed groceries and finances, and we're trying to think creatively how to do that, and but also respond quickly to say, you know what, we've got groceries on your doorstep when you need it, and trying to be available for people in that sense. I think that's probably for us. And also, food banks as well, we've found have lost a lot of resources of people donating food. You know, people are scared and people can't get the food that they would normally have. And lots of people who had amazing incomes have people that never thought that they were in need, and now those people who need to access that and aren't the ones contributing the food necessarily. And so we've been able to, lots of our community members have been able to contribute food to different local food banks that are already, you know, have the connections and the relationships to be able to distribute that. Yeah, but we are looking for, you know, we are hoping and praying that God will continue to show us new ways and new creative things to do. And I think the church has done so well across the board in terms of being flexible and agile and creative in the way that we have responded to this, and I think that's amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that actually, Avril, something you mentioned yesterday was around that need for an adaptive mindset to be creative and agile. And I'm curious as to your thoughts about the place of that, particularly in a church that has multiple services and multiple ministries. What might it look like to keep that adaptive mindset as we move forward as the church, being true to discipleship and mission and all these things? What might that look like?
I think for me, just listening to the conversation that we're having at the moment, and when I think about where we're heading and how to be adaptive, I think it's about not looking at the crowd but looking at the one. And so if you can take your eyes off what it looks like corporately and actually focus on the needs of one person, I think then you are able to adapt fairly quickly because you're responding to a need in an individual. And so I think moving that's been a wonderful thing to watch happen over the last few months, because we've had to. We haven't had corporate gatherings, so we've actually had to pick up the phone and have those one-on-one conversations. It's become about the one, but if we're moving out of this season, we need to continue to be adaptable because things are going to continue to shift and change. And I think we need to keep focusing in on individual people in the process to help guide that.
Yeah, that's such a great insight. Thank you. Charlie, what are you seeing from your perspective in terms of the need for kind of an entrepreneurial spirit or, you know, thinking differently, being adaptive, focusing on the one in that? What are your reflections?
Yeah, I think it's very timely. The adage that I came across a couple of months ago, and I feel like a lot of leaders of our generation are listening to Mark Sayers and John Mark Comer, who are kind of cultural, I don't want to say analysts or anything like that, because they're much more than that. They've got this unique ability to really kind of prophetically understand the times of what's going on. And I think my greatest encouragement for anyone in this season would be that personal renewal leads to corporate renewal. And for me, that's just been such a stripping back, such a profound awareness of, oh God, like what are you doing in my life? And then you really get to that place, and I've heard dependency across this conversation, is really, that's always how it was meant to be. Jesus constantly demonstrating that to his disciples, 100%. Utter dependence upon the Father. And sometimes in our systems and way of thinking, we can just create ways of doing things that are not dependent upon God. And I've just found myself going, God, if you don't come on through here, this is going to fall on its face. And it's actually the sweetest place to be, because then you're going, this is not of man's doing, this is of God's doing. And so in and through that, there seems to just be kingdom opportunities that do pop up. You know, like when we go, God, I'm on my knees again before you, there are ways forward, there are doors that open, there are things that happen in terms of, you know, leading a church plant in this season. Like, what a horribly blessed time to lead a church plant, you know, like as we, you know, that kind of myth of momentum that I kind of heard people talking about yesterday. But even in that, the beauty of leading a new church is that you are in that stage of absolute adaptability. Like, there are no set ways of doing things at this point in time. And so the beauty of that is that it's all up in the air and we innovate again, but then it's just about constantly coming back to the Lord and going, don't just make this a good idea, make this a God idea, you know, like, well, don't make it, I'm coming to you, you know. And so I would say I've been leaning very heavily on that idea of personal renewal. And for Jess and I, as we lead Oak City Church, we've just found that time and time again, he's giving us more of a hunger for him. Yeah. He's giving us more of a love for people. And that wasn't there before this. It was there in dribs and drabs, but it's becoming more of a stream, more of a trickle, hopefully more of a flood. And I'd continue to invite that into each and every one of our ministries.
It's pretty, I'm excited that like that tends to be the norm conversation. Like even here, like Northside, church of great history, it's now like Sam and us, the team, are like really getting to like, how do we adapt an organization that has been set up for so long and has such good structures, and like that's who we are. The exciting thing is to start to go, but who cares? Like, what's next? Like that, there's a real beauty, and like hearing that from senior pastor after senior pastor across denominations is like everyone seems to have that same sense of like, it starts with me, but then also, then what does God teach me about who I lead and what I lead, and you know what's happening corporately. And so I think there's been a great shift in the language, at least, of people just going like, God's got to come through, and I just got to get on my knees and just trust that He's going to do His thing. Because someone said, it's like, God, you got to come through because it's your reputation that's on the line. Like, and so you kind of just going, well, back at you, like.
Yeah, like totally. Like He promised He'd pour out rain upon dry land. You know, that's the promise that we stand upon even in this season. And so to audaciously of the church in 2020 to go, not ever acting like spoiled brats, but going, God, we want to be part of new wine. We want to be part of whatever you're doing in this new season. And we're all in for it.
It's great. It's very good.
So good. Any final comments from this side? All good?
All good.
Over here?
I'd like, stemming from an earlier comment, is like just how, I mean, it's we're of the younger generation, and so this, it's interesting that our language can often be so like new, fresh, like, but I think the great honouring going like, what a foundation that we have for people that have tirelessly sacrificed, prayed for this moment, prayed for the next generation, that they would sit on a lounge and get excited about what the church could look like or what could be fresh in the movement. And so I just think a great thank you to those that have gone before to lay this foundation and to teach us at least, and to birth something in us that would want to come out and would want to explore all the goodness of God and all that He has to offer, and to push past the realms of possibility in reliance on God and say, like, what could be? So I think it's a great opportunity to say thanks and to honour those people in our life. Yeah.
Yep, Absolutely. Thank you. Well said. Well, thank you for your time, guys. Really appreciate you sharing your hearts and your perspective, your insights, and just your sense about what God is doing. And we're praying that this will be a blessing for those who watch it, and that it's been a blessing for you today as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Anne.
Thanks for having us, Anne.